Welcome to episode 2 of Positively Geared. My name is Alex Augustiniak, and today we'll be discussing a very important topic, knowing your why. Knowing your why dictates the strategy which Lloyd will implement to ensure you reach your goal of financial freedom. Welcome, Lloyd.
Hi, Alex. How are you going?
Very good. Episode 2.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it.
Today we're talking about knowing your why, which I think is probably the fundamental pillar, if you like, for people that are looking to start a property portfolio.
Absolutely, yeah. So really, you can't just go out there and just buy a property and then wonder what it's going to do for you. So I always get people thinking about why they're going to do it. What are they trying to achieve? And how is this property going to help them? Do they want to build a portfolio of properties? And why would they want to build a portfolio of properties? And then whether they should be investing in, and we'll get to talk about the strategy, but whether they should be investing in a capital city or a regional area, whether they should be doing cash flow or growth or manufacturing equity and all that kind of stuff. But it's got to start from why you actually want to do it.
Absolutely. And I think I reflect upon, my personal life and I think you're probably similar and everybody's very similar in the sense that I think we all know somebody that's bought that investment that didn't ever quite achieve the growth or yield that they wanted. And that's usually greeted with a lot of regret or resentment later in life. So I think knowing your why and having a strategy is absolutely fundamental to getting this right.
Yeah, it's amazing how often you'll go to a Sunday afternoon family barbecue and everybody's got an opinion on property.
Yeah,
it's one of those things that I think, not everybody has an opinion on everything. You can be a doctor or you can be a scientist and, people don't know about that subject unless they're qualified. But in property, everybody's got an opinion on
Everyone's an expert.
Absolutely. And then, it's like there's always someone who's telling a story about, yes, my brother-in-law bought a property and it didn't go so well and, it was in Broken Hill and whatever. And then, there's all these stories and that makes sort of people nervous whether they should be doing it. And even when it comes down to, the other question is, when is the right time to buy? When is the right time to buy is not necessarily, trying to time the market and thinking, oh, well, is it too late to buy now, or whether we should be, buying when the market cools, or, that's one way of looking at it. But it's also about, there's always a good opportunity to buy and you just need to have a strategy in place, what I should be buying, where I should be buying. And that kind of mitigates against a lot of those little, nervous issues you might have about buying property if you actually have a real understanding of what you're trying to achieve out of it. Absolutely.
And I think a good analogy is possibly that, in life or in business, particularly in property investment, whatever the person wants to achieve, it's really just a strategy, a bridge or a system, if you like, towards where they are today and to get to where they want to be. And the beauty of a strategy is that it's immune to market conditions. It doesn't matter what the weather's doing that particular day or who's in government. It's basically about having a plan in place which will allow you to get from A to B. And that's what we're effectively going to cover off on today in our conversation.
Absolutely, yeah. And we've got to remember that property is a vehicle. So property is not something you should get too emotional about. Just like whether you're buying stocks, whether you're in the share market or whether you're buying gold or whatever you want to be doing, property is a vehicle to create wealth, and it's about how to use that vehicle effectively to get from A to B. To create a roadmap for your vehicle to get to each of those destinations. The first step is obviously know your why. So when I first talk to people, I really ask them what they want to achieve. Where do you really want to be in 10, 15 years time? A lot of people say, I want to retire tomorrow, or I want to retire in 5 years time. But quite often, people want to retire. They think they want to retire because the grass is always greener on the other side. But effectively, that doesn't really make people happy, because people might think they can go and retire, just sit on a beach for the rest of their lives, but then they'll get really bored. I know with me, I'll keep working till I'm 100 if I can, because I love doing what I'm doing. So I think for people, it's really about creating choice and putting themselves in a good position. Why they're doing something should be about what their long-term goals are. Now, that could be financial freedom because they do actually want to retire genuinely in 10 years' time, or maybe they want to have one partner stay at home, so they can go down to one income, one partner to look after the kids. They might want to be able to afford to put the kids through private schools, which are really expensive. Or they might want to go on overseas holidays without having to worry about where the money is coming from. Yeah, another goal might be, I just want to work 4 days a week instead of 5. I've actually got a client who's just achieved that recently. Actually, we bought about 3 or 4 properties for him, and he's in a position now where he's actually working 4 days a week, and he actually goes to the pub on Fridays, and he says, I don't work Fridays. He just goes and tells all his mates, says, I don't work Fridays. So that's a pretty cool thing to be doing as well.
It's a big win for him.
It is a big win for him, but you need to have that goal in place. Know why you're doing something, and it means different things for different people. Having a dream house, on the beach, or having a house by the park, or just having nice security for your family. Whether that's it could be owning a townhouse near the city, whatever. All those things mean different things for different people. But it's really important to actually know why you're doing something, and from there we can then formulate a strategy on how to actually get there.
Absolutely, and I think knowing your why. And building that strategy, if it's fair to say, Lloyd, needs to be greeted with a certain degree of realism. So, for example, for somebody that might approach you in public, or a client that, wants to do business with you, if they're to say to you, look, Lloyd, I want to be retired in 12 months, you've probably got to have a conversation with them around, okay, well, is this goal achievable or not? Is it realistic or not?
That's very true. And I do get people like that. I do get people who say they want to retire in 2 years, or they want to retire in 5 years. They're starting from, they've got nothing at the moment. They're on a job they're not happy with. They've got no assets. Realistically, some people can, retire in maybe, 5 to 7 years. If they've already got a few assets, they've got some good cash put away, then we can formulate a strategy there. But if you're sort of starting from nowhere, when I say nowhere, I mean like you're sort of starting from the fact that you actually haven't got any investments, you want to try to build up to that. It's going to take you a little bit longer. It's one of the things I do cover in the book, Positively Geared, which is effectively how to start a portfolio from $40,000, which is essentially a deposit on a property, and then how to recycle that deposit to build up a portfolio. It is possible to be able to achieve financial freedom in a 10, 12-year period, but you need to have that strategy in place and actually know what you're doing. And that's where I started from. I had a $30,000 deposit and built up from there. But you really do need to have an understanding of what you're trying to do, and also realize that it does take time, that you're looking at this short-term pain for long-term gain. You need to delay all your gratification. Don't worry about driving the Lamborghini just now. That can come later. You want to just be realistic about things now and work towards those goals.
So for people that are listening right now that are very intrigued as to, okay, well, what does that strategy look like? And possibly their first reaction will be, okay, well, Lloyd, I don't have 10 years to throw at building a property portfolio, or I don't have 5 years to wait for this investment to mature. What advice would you give to them just to, I guess, keep them grounded, but also give them confidence that this stuff works and that it doesn't require 20 years to see the tangible rewards?
Well, that's right. And look, I actually have clients in their late 50s who have actually come to me and they said, I want to be retired in 5 years, but I've got a lot of debt, and how can I get out of that debt and actually have some positive investments? So that comes down to strategy. In the particular case I'm referring to, that involved actually building some duplexes, creating some equity, selling the properties for some profit, having good cash flow on the others. So having positive income, positive cash flow properties that also have that equity there is a really good way of getting ahead quicker, and that's certainly possible for people who don't have such a long time frame ahead of them. But if you feel you don't have a long time to do something, then you need to be realistic about what it is you're trying to achieve. So coming and say you want to have a $300,000 passive income within the next 5 years when you're currently working for an employer and you're only on $50,000, then there's no magic bullet there. So it's not as if you can suddenly do that. Otherwise, if it was that easy, everyone would be doing it. So it's one of those things.
We'll be multimillionaires with lots of properties.
That's right. So, so there are strategies around there, but you need to be realistic about that. Strategy does come down to age as well, because if you're in your 20s, then you actually effectively do have quite a bit of working life. And assuming not everyone in their 20s wants to retire, you could have 20 years to build up a good portfolio, which would be a mixture of lots of different types of properties, from blue chip properties to cash flow properties to properties where you manufacture growth. If you're starting your portfolio a little bit later in life, then we'd be focusing more on properties where you can actually get your gains faster, your equity gains faster, which would be ones where you can manufacture growth. And that can be through land subdivisions, through developing properties, through cosmetic renovations, even structural renovations if you've got the appetite for that. So there's certainly options there. But the thing about any of those strategies is that you're actually adding value yourself to the property rather than waiting for the market to grow. And if you can add value to the property yourself, then you're not going to be sitting there for ages wondering whether it's going to grow in value. You're actually forcing that value, and that allows you to leverage yourself into another property and so on, and get to your goals a little bit quicker.
Yeah. So from there, basically, once you define the different factors, for example, as you mentioned, in terms of manufacturing growth, improving cash flow, renovating, improving all those things, it starts to snowball. I think one of the key factors in ensuring that any person's strategy is successful, and I know that you do a lot of work with your clients on this, it's mitigating risk. So tell us about some of your past experiences where things haven't gone quite to plan. And I guess if you're sitting in front of a client today, what sort of strategies do you put in place to ensure that they're as less risk adverse as possible?
Yeah, so that's a really good point, and quite often I'll have people, some will come to me and they say they're really risk adverse, they don't want anything risky. And then there's other people say that we're happy to take some risk because we want to try to get, they say, no risk, no reward. So if we take a lot of risk, we'll get higher reward. It doesn't always work that way either. There's a few things that have, I've done myself in the past in my portfolio that hasn't worked so well. I mentioned in the last episode about a property I bought in central Queensland mining town of Blackwater. One of the things to mitigate risk when you're buying a property is the location of that property, and we'll talk more about locations later on. If you're buying a property that is in an area that has several industries of economic growth, that mitigates against the risk of any real price falls. If you've got a migration there, you've got population increase, you've got jobs growth, then those sort of things are going to be, the area is going to have good fundamentals. So obviously you get them in capital cities, like Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, for example. But, if you've got a bit of a cheaper budget, you want to go to somewhere regional, you can still get into good regional centres that have those sort of, those sort of growth drivers. And as well as that, buying close to amenities, such as cafes and shops, and then close to transport, and all those sort of things, that kind of mitigates the risk. So those true fundamentals of a property are really important there. So that's one example. Another way of mitigating risk for someone who's a little bit more savvier, wanting to do, say, a development, we're going to do a duplex, for example, crunching the numbers, making sure that it actually works for you. If you're going to build a duplex and you're going to sell the properties individually, or you're going to take equity out of them, you need to make sure that it's worth more on completion than what you paid for it. And again, we'll discuss that in more detail later. It's really important to make sure that you're actually building for less than what you can sell it for. And that mitigates your risk. And you look at the comparable sales in the area for that, because you don't want to be spending $600,000 building a duplex and to find that each unit's only going to sell for $250,000. So that's $500,000, and your minus $100,000 in equity. It needs to work the other way.
Yeah.
And just crunching those numbers and having some actual data there to show that yes, in this area we can actually make profit on this property. So those sort of things are really important as well.
And is there a golden rule, Lloyd, with looking at more down the avenue of investment in the development space, be it, sort of owner builder or developing, townhomes or granny flats? Is there a golden sort of ratio that you look for yourself or your clientele base in terms of, a net profit margin?
In terms of profit margin on a duplex, generally looking at between 15 to 18%. Now, quite often you can get up to 25% returns, but you're looking at sort of 15 to 80% returns, which is sort of fairly realistic, given the fact that you're wanting to go with what I call my trifecta there. It's not really my trifecta, but I'll refer to it as my trifecta for now. We've got your instant equity, you've got your cash flow, and you've got your capital growth as well. So you want all three things. Sometimes you can go into an area where there's massive amounts of instant equity and really good cash flow, so really good rent. but it might be an area where the long-term growth isn't as good. So it's not really achieving all. It may not be that good for your portfolio. So it may not be, and that's where strategy is really important. Getting a 25% return in an area where you're not going to get much growth after that won't necessarily be as good as if you just get a 15% immediate return on a duplex build, and then you actually got that good capital growth to back it up. Because essentially you're building a portfolio towards financial freedom. So you want to be able to keep that and make sure that you're actually getting growth in the years to come as well.
Excellent. So let's take a deep dive straight into strategy from the ground up. We've sort of identified, some of the markers to look for. We've touched on mitigating risk. If I were seeing you today for the first time as a prospective client, or just somebody, a friend or family member seeking your advice, what does that sort of conversation look like?
Yeah, so the first conversation is really, Alex, where would you like to be in 10 years, 15 years' time? What are your goals? And we talk about, those things that I mentioned earlier about what financial independence really means to you. Some people may not have a family, but they may have a family later on. Other people do have a family to consider now and all those kind of things. So that's really important. So we ascertain that. The next thing to ascertain is your borrowing power. So you really need to speak to a bank or a mortgage broker. I advocate reputable mortgage brokers because a good mortgage broker will have access to a number of different lenders, should be able to find a good scenario that suits your circumstances. You can't really do anything without knowing the numbers. So you might have dreams to go and build up a multi-million-dollar property portfolio and buy a couple of properties straight away, worth over $1 million. But if you don't have the numbers, if you're, if the bank says you can only borrow $500K, then that's not going to work. So getting those numbers right to start with is really important. It doesn't matter really what your numbers are. We can always work with that. The first property I bought, I spent about $260,000 on and built up from there. So you don't need to be spending $1 million or more on a property to start with. If they've got better borrowing capacity, higher incomes and less debt and everything, the broker says you can borrow $1.5 million or something like that. I wouldn't suggest you go and spend all that on one property. That's where we'd set the strategy and say you could actually build 3 properties or buy 3 properties for this. You might build a duplex, you might buy another blue chip property, you might do something else and start the strategy like that. But the first thing to really look at are those numbers and to see where your numbers sit. So the broker would do that. You need to supply your details to the broker, which is basically your incomes, and then bank statements and things like that, and also any other debts you got, any loans you got, any credit card debts. I always recommend people try to minimise their credit card debts because that can come against you with serviceability and everything. I never even had a credit card till I was about 35, and then I only bought one because I felt that was necessary when I was booking things like flights and hotels online. The problem with that is you could have a credit card that's got a limit on it for say $10,000, and you may not even use it, but the bank will still assess you for the full amount.
Because they look at it as a liability. You could go out tomorrow and spend all that money.
Absolutely. And they assess a minimum of a 3% repayment per month. So they will think you're still paying $300 a month on that $10,000 credit card, even if you're not, which means that comes off your serviceability. So those little things, and the broker will go into those sort of details with you. But keeping those things in mind and getting rid of those issues will actually help improve your serviceability there. So that's the next step, finance. Once we've got finance in place, then we start looking at what we can do in terms of actual property deals, and that also then takes into account what properties you might already have. Some people might be starting from scratch and not have any properties. Other people might have a few properties. I've got one client, for example, who's got 35 properties, and he probably came to me when he had about 32 properties, and he wanted me to keep helping him build his portfolio. So we had to fit in a detailed strategy about where he is or where he was at the time and build from there. Other people might have 1 or 2 properties, and then we need to build those current properties into that goal. Sometimes a few tricky things. Sometimes I've got clients who might have 6 or 8 properties, but they're pretty maxed out. So some of the advice might be you need to sell a couple of properties to be able to move forward. So there's quite a few details things in with strategy. You're maxed out and you've got negative cash flow, then you really need to fix that up before you can move forward with the strategy with anything else. And that's something that I assist with as well. So that's all part of that strategy. Once we've got that happening, then we look at what sort of property would be the best one to buy. And that's where we can talk about manufacturing equity. Depending on your budget, we could be buying a house in in a suburb of one of the capital cities, and we look at what the rental yield on it is, what the growth prospects are, and whether we can add some value to it, through either cosmetic renovation or perhaps it's got the potential to subdivide if it's a larger block and maybe develop later on, because that'll be a great strategy for you as well. Or we might look straight away. Okay, I think the first strategy would be to develop a duplex, because you'll get that immediate equity, and then use that equity to fund another purchase, which is not necessarily another duplex, but then it might be a blue chip property. I remember even the very first duplex I did, I then used the equity in that to fund a property in Brisbane and a property in Newcastle, just out of that equity. So, and I think a third one as well, also in Brisbane. So you can do a lot of stuff with that equity. So having that strategy in place and understanding what you can do. So if you're going to create equity, then you think, okay, what can we do with the next property, and so on, and getting an understanding of how each property works, how it fits into your portfolio, and how we can move forward towards your goals from there.
What really resonated with me, and probably hopefully everybody listening right now also picks up on it, it's knowing your numbers. If we sort of assess people that have succeeded in business and property, and I suppose any investment vehicle, it's really important and essential that they are very grounded and have a solid understanding about what the numbers are. And I'll give an example. I was having coffee with a client the other week, and they're looking to invest some money into a certain area, and as we dug a bit deeper, they weren't actually sure what the yield was for this particular suburb, and you probably find that all the time. So it's really important that before somebody does invest into a certain area, that they really understand the ins and outs of the area, what the yields are, what the average sale prices are, what the average days on market is, because all of that is, I suppose, mitigating your risk factor, isn't it?
Well, absolutely, yeah. Some really good points there, Alex. Just picking up one of those things in terms of the yield, because a lot of people don't understand that, but it's also then getting an understanding of what gross yield is and then what net yield is. And of course, working out net yield is getting then an understanding of, all the council rate notices, and if you're buying in a strata building, what the body corporate costs are, because they'll all come down to sort of decrease your yield to become net yield. The other thing that people don't think about too, which also has to come into strategy, is how much deposit they put into a property. So the true yield is really worked out on putting in 100% on a property. But the banks don't lend you 100% on a property. Banks generally lend you 80%, maybe 90% if you're lucky. The other 10 or 20% you've got to come up with, but that might be either through cash savings you've got, or you might have taken equity from another property. So you've got to sort of consider that, and whether you're weighing that into the yield. And just give you an example, I was meeting with a client yesterday, and he's wanting to increase his rental yield on a property he's buying in Sydney. The increasing his rental yield in terms of cash flow by how much money he's got coming in each month by actually putting more deposit down on the property. So he's buying a property where he's actually looking at putting about 50% deposit down. So he's going to have a much lower loan. But what that means is he's actually making that property cash flow positive in real terms against the loan. So that's a strategy to consider. Not that everybody's got 50% deposit to put down, but that's something to sort of consider there about what sort of loan amount you're comfortable with. Quite often, people put down a 20% deposit, but you can put down a 10% deposit, but then you've got to pay lender's mortgage insurance, and people need to understand that lender's mortgage insurance doesn't cover them, it just covers the lender, and it's a cost to them. The other thing to also realise is it's capitalised, so when you sell the property, that's taken into account. So there's a lot of things there to weigh in, and that comes in on strategy. Just like when you're building a portfolio and we're talking about any potential exit plan, we need to look at the potential ramifications with things like capital gains tax and GST and things. So people need to get proper advice from their accountant and things like that, and we'll discuss all that in another series as well.
So in terms of, I think we've identified that the importance of having a good strategy, and obviously that strategy is going to differ for the individual and what their personal goals are, and where they sort of hope to be in the next 2, 5, 10 years. We've addressed that it's really important that people are realistic about what they can achieve. With that said, I do think also, and this is something that I've taken away from our time together, that a lot of people also at the same time, while some are very unrealistic, the other side of the coin is that people, they actually underestimate what they can achieve in a relatively short period of time.
Absolutely, yeah. And people also need to sort of realise that sometimes people think they just want to take out the minimum loan and buy the cheapest property because they want to mitigate the risk. That's not mitigating the risk at all. And you might buy a better property, better location, pay more, and if it's got a better rental yield, then that's actually going to have be a better property for you as well. And there's also those options where sometimes we might suggest that if you've got enough deposit, then rather than paying say 20% on one property, you might actually buy two properties with your paying 10% deposit each and things like that. So if people are pretty savvy and they want to get ahead quicker, then that's part of working out that that strategy and thinking, well, you don't need to just buy one property and wait for 5 years. You can actually do this, this, and this, and we talk through that. And of course, it's up to people what they individually want to do, but it's good to leave people's options open. Part of the strategy, of course, is the different phases. So you're going to have the acquisition phase where you're actually going through and building those properties into your portfolio, and then you need to hold them for a while, and then you've got that exit strategy, which is essentially where you're going to, at the time that you actually want to achieve that financial independence, you want to sort of sell half your properties and pay down all your debt, and then you just have all this positive cash flow coming into your bank. So we always talk about that. The exit strategy is part of that portfolio, and that all comes in depending on your risk appetite and what age you're at. If you're 28, no interest in retiring at the moment, then it might seem like a long way away to be thinking of an exit strategy 20 years away. But it's good to be thinking about that, and we can work with that. If you're investing later in life, then the exit strategy is going to be a little bit sooner. When you're 55 years of age and older, the banks actually ask you for a letter of what your exit strategy is, because you don't really have 30 years to pay back a loan. Essentially, banks don't see that you've got 30 years to pay back a loan, so they actually want to know your exit strategy and how you're going to dispose of that property or pay off that loan within a reasonable time frame.
Well, they should give you the money.
Absolutely, yeah.
So, Lloyd, we've given our listeners a pretty good rundown on knowing your why and the reasons we buy property and the strategies behind successfully building a portfolio or starting a portfolio. Let's cover off on probably two, profiles which will sort of reflect the majority of listeners. And the first one would be, your mum and dad investors. So they own a primary residence. They're possibly renting where they currently live. They've got some money in the bank, albeit not a lot, and they're looking to get started. What does that? What would the meeting with them look like, and what would you really want to identify? I suppose just beyond looking at strategy at face value, how would you sort of handle that, and what advice would you give those listeners today?
So one thing that I think, given that strategy, and they're probably like renting where they live, I would not be recommending they necessarily go and buy a home straight away. The problem with buying their own home is that decreases their serviceability right away. So again, it would be about what they're looking to achieve, and then if they've got one investment property, what we'd be looking at doing is how we can leverage off that. Generally, if they've got one investment property, they might have a bit of equity in that and a bit of cash savings. So I'd be getting them to have a chat to their broker. I work with a number of good brokers too, if anybody needs a recommendation there, and they just need to put their cash savings with any equity they got in their property and then do their numbers. It all comes back to their numbers. So their total borrowing capacity, take into account their current property, then all their other living expenses, given the fact they're paying rent, not a mortgage. So that's actually going to put them in a better condition. Look at the equity position they currently got, then trying to move forward to the next property. But I'd be looking at their goals and then wanting to try to fast track that a little bit quicker. So I'd be looking at ways to manufacture some equity there, and as we discussed, there's a few ways we can do that. And when I talk about building a duplex or renovating a property, it's not that you have to go there and do it yourself. It's about getting reputable builders and tradespeople in there to do that. But that's that would be what I'd be looking at there. Again, looking at their long-term goals, but their second property needs to complement the one that they currently got. And then the second property that we're going to add some value to, look at how we can leverage off that to get into the next property. One of their goals might be to have their dream home one day, but we don't need to buy that straight away. We can work up towards that. Generally, if you got your own home that you're living in, that's seen as a liability. You can't claim any tax deductions on it. You can't claim the interest on it. if you're just paying rent and then you're actually got your investment loans, for other properties, then that actually improves your serviceability. So if your serviceability being whether you can pay back a loan or your ability to pay back the loan. So if you're living in your primary residence and then you go for an investment loan, you're probably going to have lower serviceability than if you're actually renting and then going for investment loans. So one thing that I recommend a lot of people do these days is rent invest. So rent vesting is something which is essentially just that. Rent where you want to. So that might be, where you want to live. So it might be close to work, might be in the lifestyle location that you like, but not necessarily where you would buy. It might be out of budget for where you would buy. So that's one reason people rent vest, because they can buy in other locations that are a bit cheaper. But the other thing is, you don't really buy an investment property in the location where you live or work at, unless that's the best location in the property in the country to buy property. And there's probably plenty of other good locations to look at. So we'll look at the best places to invest in property, and you just keep renting where you want to live, and then you've got freedom of lifestyle there.
It's really good to know, because I think, there is a lot of stigma attached to renting. In my experience, I find some people, you'll, as you mentioned earlier, you'll be at a family barbecue or a function, and there'll always be somebody saying, I won't rent a property, that's dead money, this, that and the other. But I think having that awareness that it definitely does have its place is very important.
Yeah, it kind of drives me crazy when people say it's dead money. I mean, I feel that's a bit of a 90s-ism. People used to talk about that 20 or 30 years ago, and they're sort of saying it's not really dead money, because once you've got an investment property, you've got people paying rent there, and that's going towards your mortgage and everything like that. As a landlord, you can't really be thinking that, it's bad to be renting. And then, if you have a portfolio of 10 properties and you've got 10 lots of tenants in there, you can't then have the attitude that renting's bad because you've got all these tenants. You're actually responsible to have a property that's got good upkeep and, suitable for them to live in, and you're providing homes for people. Renting's seen to be, lower socioeconomic or in properties that aren't that good. But, you can rent beautiful properties. You can rent multi-million-dollar properties if you want, that you couldn't afford to buy, in general terms, people couldn't afford to buy, but you could rent them and have a lovely lifestyle. So there's certainly nothing wrong with renting a property. I think ultimately, most people would like to own a property to live in because it provides stability for their family. But you don't necessarily need to, try to force yourself to buy your own home now when it's going to, put you at risk of not being able to build up your portfolio. Because if you're sort of a younger person, around 30 or so, and then you wanted to get into your own home, I would be thinking, rent for now, build up a portfolio, buy that dream home when you're 36 or 40, and then you'll be in a better position.
In terms of a real life case study or an experience you've had with somebody sort of that we've just profiled in that very position, and they possibly do own their primary residence or are renting. Do you have an example, Lloyd, of sort of how you've assisted somebody in sort of going on that journey in terms of starting that portfolio off, and what were some of the challenges that they faced and you faced?
Yeah, I do. And the couple I'm thinking of there's actually a doctor and his wife who was working in pharmaceuticals, a couple of primary school children. They were actually living in their primary residence at the time. They had a little bit of cash savings, and then they had equity in their home. But what they actually did, and we sat down and had a good roundtable discussion regarding strategy, and we had the broker there, they ended up moving out of their primary residence and renting another property. And then, so the primary residence became a rental property. We also took equity out of that property to go and buy for another property. So they had equity there plus the cash savings, and the broker did some figures. What we did with that particular family is we got them into a duplex deal because one of their goals was to try to fast track some equity creation, because they wanted to actually be able to afford, although on fairly good incomes, they didn't feel they were really getting ahead, and they had quite a lot of living expenses and a little bit of debt. They had a couple of car loans there, and a bit of other, I think, high credit cards, which they ended up sort of having to pay off. But the strategy there was to actually build a duplex where they actually created about $220,000 in equity. So it was actually a really good result there. From that, they actually could take some money out of that property from the equity and then got themselves into another property as well straight away using that equity. So it sort of fast-tracked their portfolio there.
And what sort of period of time did that sort of transpire over?
Yeah, so Yeah, they were pretty responsive to. I guess the first meeting I had with them, where I was sort of suggesting you might be in a better position if you think about renting out this PPR. They weren't so receptive to that at the start, but once the broker did some numbers and gave them a couple of scenarios, then it was quite obvious that they'll be in a better position if they would actually rent out that principal place of residence, put tenants in there. So that probably took about a month or two to sort that out in the numbers. Once we got them into the duplex deal, that was sort of a turnaround in 12 months. So they essentially made over $200,000 in 12 months, which is sort of pretty similar to what their actual family income was, because the guys are relatively sort of junior doctors, so not on. Sometimes people think doctors earn huge amounts of money, but junior doctors don't earn. They work really hard and don't earn massive amounts, so they didn't have that bigger income. So the amount of money they made from the duplex in one duplex deal was pretty much the same as what the couples were earning as a combined income. So that put them in a good position. That was after 12 months. Then they had the serviceability to go into another property, the following year. So, and essentially, and that was in a different city, actually a different state, and there's a strategy around that because of land tax and things like that as well. Essentially, a couple of years down the track, and they were in a much better position, and they only used the equity in that duplex for one more property, and then that actually a lot of the equity left over from that they were actually able to use on kids' school fees and to pay off some car loans and stuff as well. So it actually really helped them out.
When you first met with them, what were some of the fears that you found that they had, or possible roadblocks or hurdles that you had to help them overcome?
I think the main thing, and it's the main thing with a lot of people, is actually the fear of debt, and always understanding the difference between good debt and bad debt. They had 3 car loans at the time, which is quite funny because there's only two people in the house that could drive. They had 3 cars, all had car loans on them. They don't mind having, people don't mind having car loans, but people are scared about having, property debt. But property debt's always good debt, because I always think if you've got loans on something that appreciates, then that's going to be good debt.
Well, one always depreciates, and in most 99.9% of cases, and the other one generally always appreciates.
Well, that's right. So you need to buy either a house in a good location, or a violin or something, because that appreciates, but not car loans. So so they had to get their head around that, and that took a little bit of convincing as well. But that they were quite receptive to that in the end. Once they saw the results, then they really became really receptive to that and really happy. And we're actually in a position of now talking to them again about the next property. This is a couple of years down the track, but they're now looking at doing the next thing as well.
Excellent. And I suppose looking at the stark contrast of that couple there, who sort of probably are in a similar position to a lot of people listening today that are sort of early into their investment portfolio journey, although they've already, they own an asset, or they're income producing and either have families or don't. Tell me about some clients you've worked with. I know you mentioned one earlier, where they've already got a very strong portfolio, and then they're seeking your advice on how to add and build to that. What does that sort of conversation look like, and how do you find the strategy differs to, a mum and dad family trying to buy their first or second property?
Yeah, so the strategy is very different with someone with a complex portfolio. We look at their spreadsheet with all their properties, look at all their debt against their equity, to see the situation they're in. So we sort of look at the equity against the loan and the cash flow on the property to assess their current situation. The other thing also is assessing where they are in terms of their current locations, because we wanted to look at trying to avoid or minimise land tax as much as possible, and each state has sort of land tax thresholds. And then also looking at the different trusts to buy in, because sometimes they're buying in like an accompanied trust or a discretionary trust, or maybe in personal names, and there's a bit of a mixture there, and they all have different tax implications, and that's where an accountant comes in quite handy to that conversation as well. But at the end of the day, it's still about what they're trying to achieve, and a lot of the time there's people that have 6 or 7 properties that are actually in a fair bit of debt, and then we need to untangle a few things to move forward. But once people sort of get past that 10 or 12 properties, they're usually in a pretty good position and they've got things under control. So it's just a matter of really looking at what they're trying to achieve. And quite often they're now looking for more sophisticated strategies. So we might be building a triplex, a quadplex, building duplexes, doing some land banking, subdividing some blocks and selling them off, or getting DAs on them and selling them off. There's some complicated things there. So it's completely different sort of strategies, but it's all about what their goals are. So it all comes back to knowing your why, and ask them, okay, so you have 30 properties. These people are business owners, they're quite busy, and they just want someone to help keep building their portfolio.
And in your experience, Lloyd, do you find that the rewards become more tangible once you get to that 20 and 30 property mark? Or, I mean, not everybody that's going to be listening to this is going to necessarily want to build an empire, but I think financial freedom is what we've identified that you're really here to help people achieve. And, we know that's different to everybody. But for those who are quite keen to build a portfolio similar to yours, do you find that once you get to that threshold where you sort of possibly break the glass ceiling at 8 to 10 properties, do the rewards become bigger, or is it very much just rinse and repeat and sticking to a solid strategy where you're sort of, I suppose, over time, identifying good buying locations with the same principles as when you started out?
Yeah, look, the principles are the same there. For me, the biggest rewards are really for people who are just starting out and might buy their first property and they get a really good return on it. And whatever that return looks like depends on their strategy. Not everyone does a duplex, so I'm using them as a couple of examples. They might renovate, they might just hold, and they might buy in the right part of the cycle, and a couple of years later they've made some good growth. I mean, I've got examples of people who have just made 100, 200 grand profit on a property simply because they bought at the right time in the cycle. But just seeing the results of something, because it comes down to your everyday mum and dad, seeing them, how happy they are, how enthusiastic they are after having a good result on a property, that really sort of inspires me, and then wanting to repeat the process. I think once people have got a lot of properties under their belt, then it's more like a bit of a rinse and repeat. It's not really about the numbers. So it's not about trying to build 20 or 30 properties and having an empire. It's really about having, achieving your dreams. And you might have 6 properties and they're functioning really well for you. You've got good equity, and that's helping you to achieve what you want to achieve. So it's really about getting the right properties that achieve that for you.
What do you recommend for people listening today that are embarking on this journey? And I think what happens is once you start to let people get a taste for that success, they've had the first successful investment, or they've possibly got up to their third property, and they're starting to see that the banks are wanting to give them more money, and they're becoming more bank worthy, more credit worthy. How do you sort of, I suppose, guide your clients through that process? Or what advice would you give listeners today so that once they start to see that they've got, possibly tens of thousands in equity that they can draw down, that they're not necessarily going down to, the Mercedes dealership and wanting to buy a new S-Class because all of a sudden they've got their money working for them finally?
Yeah, we just need to, they need to have someone keeping them accountable. So, talking to a mentor every couple of weeks, writing the goals down and sharing it with people. So with me, people tell me what their goals are, and, we have that in our database and everything. And, I want to remind people of that. Sometimes people get confused about strategies. They might have this goal, and then they might buy one property and then decide they're going to change strategies and do something else. It's like, but hang on, that's not what we spoke about. So it's about keeping people accountable, and remember, this is what you're trying to achieve. Changing here is not going to help. So it's really about just, sort of just reminding people about what that end goal is, and doing it one step at a time. But they need someone to help keep them accountable, whether it's, someone like myself helping them out, or, whether it's a work colleague or a family member. Someone needs to be just consistently reminding them of why they're doing it. And I guess you as yourself need to take some accountability about, this is why I'm doing it, and I've got to stick to this strategy.
I suppose to recap, Lloyd, today was really about understanding what your why is. And, we agree that everybody's why is going to be different. But, we've really laid down the foundations on the importance of a strategy that works for the individual. That strategy will obviously differ from person to person. When we sort of then really dig deeper into strategy, we've also identified that, strategy is looking at a whole bunch of factors, from growth to cash flow to location, which we'll touch on in a future episode, land banking, development, and everything essentially depends on the individual. How would you sum up everything we've covered off on today? What do you think the most important takeaways for the person listening to this today?
You really just need to have a goal in place. and work towards that. For me, there's definitely more to life than just going to work every day and just doing that. You need to think where you want to be in the future and setting yourself up. And I think that's really important. And that's why I encourage people to get into investing, because otherwise, I know for me, I didn't want to be one of those people that was, 65, 70 years old, still working in a job I didn't like and then thinking, 30 years ago I could have retired and done something else, but I was too scared to take the risk and whatever. So, I encourage people to really give it a go and just try to set themselves up.
Absolutely. And I think, a lot of people do in life hold off making big decisions for fear of making the wrong one. What I feel I've taken away from our time together is that sometimes you are, or quite often, not even sometimes, you are better off to make that leap of faith. You're not always going to necessarily predict the market perfectly, but standing still and doing nothing is, a much inferior strategy than beginning a portfolio and obviously having some winners and some that don't quite perform as well.
Absolutely. And, you're not going to win them all. We all make mistakes and you just got to learn from that. But doing nothing is definitely not the right strategy. Yeah. So I really do think you need to get ahead and do something.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Lloyd. I think, for everybody listening, having a strategy, having mighty clarity around what you're doing and why you're doing it is really the foundation for everything, which we're going to start to cover off on in this series.
Great. Thanks, Alex.
Thanks, Lloyd. There you have it. Today's episode highlighted the importance of knowing your why to help you implement a strategy which will allow you to reach your end goal. Lloyd Edge covers off on this topic in far greater detail in his new book, Positively Geared, available for pre-sale now with a 1st of April release date. I strongly recommend you get a copy of Lloyd's new book so that you too can achieve your path to financial freedom.